At lunch, in the middle of a crowded Italian restaurant, my son pushed his chair back, looked straight at me, and said loud enough for the entire room to hear, "You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife isn't." The clatter of silverware stopped. Conversations at nearby tables slowed into silence. I stayed seated. If you're listening to this, stay with me until the end. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've learned that humiliation sounds the same in every city, whether it's Manhattan, Dallas, or a quiet suburb in Connecticut. That afternoon, it echoed under exposed brick walls and hanging Edison bulbs at a place called Luca's on Madison Avenue. It was supposed to be a simple family lunch. My ex-husband, Richard, had remarried 3 years after our divorce. His new wife, Claire, was 12 years younger than me and 15 years younger than him. She had soft blonde hair, a careful smile, and a way of tilting her head when she spoke, as if everything she said was gentle, even when it wasn't. Richard had suggested the lunch. "Let's all be adults," he said over the phone. "It's time we move forward." I agreed. At 71, you don't attend lunches looking for conflict. You attend them looking for peace. I wore a simple navy dress and a thin gold bracelet Richard gave me 25 years ago. I almost didn't wear it. But habits have a way of staying longer than marriages. When I arrived, Daniel and Claire were already seated. Daniel stood to hug me, but it was brief. Polite. Claire kissed the air near my cheek. "So glad you could make it," she said brightly. The table was set with white linen, polished glasses, a bottle of sparkling water already opened. Outside, traffic moved steadily. Inside, the air smelled like garlic and red wine. For the first 15 minutes, it was manageable. Claire talked about a beach property they were considering. Daniel mentioned expanding his consulting firm. Richard nodded along, pleased with himself for orchestrating civility. Then the check came. Richard reached for it automatically. Daniel stopped him. "It's fine, Dad," he said. "Claire and I have it." Claire smiled and placed her manicured hand over Daniel's. "We believe in partnership," she said lightly. There was nothing wrong with that sentence, except the way she looked at me when she said it. Richard leaned back. "Well," he said, glancing at me, "your mother always believed in independence." It wasn't an insult. Not quite. But it shifted something. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Independence," he repeated. "That's one word for it." I looked at him carefully. "What's another?" I asked calmly. The restaurant noise swelled and dipped around us. A server passed with a tray of espresso cups. Daniel exhaled sharply. "You know what?" he said, pushing his chair back. "I'm tired of pretending." Claire's hand moved slightly on the table. Not to stop him, just to steady the moment. "Tired of pretending what?" I asked. His voice rose. "That you've ever supported Dad the way Claire does." There it was. A comparison. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I supported your father for 32 years, I said evenly. Daniel shook his head. "You criticized him. You held him back. Claire actually believes in him." Richard stared at his plate. Claire didn't interrupt. "You're rewriting history," I said quietly. "No," Daniel snapped. "I'm correcting it." A couple at the next table turned toward us. "You've always made everything about yourself," he continued. "Dad's happier now. He's more successful. And it's not because of you." The word success hung between us like a verdict. "And you know what?" he added, his voice cutting through the room. "You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife isn't." Silence. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. The kind where even strangers feel secondhand embarrassment. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not from anger. From clarity. Worthless. A word designed to erase. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip. My hand did not shake. Claire finally spoke. "Daniel," she said softly. "That's enough." But her tone lacked urgency. Richard looked at me then, just briefly, as if measuring whether I would explode. I didn't. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. "You're entitled to your perspective," I said calmly. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's it. No defense." I stood slowly. "There's no defense necessary," I replied. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. She was expecting tears, or volume, or a scene that would confirm whatever version of me she had quietly fed him. Instead, I reached into my purse, removed my card, and placed enough cash on the table to cover my meal and the tip. "I won't be staying for dessert," I said. As I walked past their table, I paused for just a second beside Daniel. "You called me worthless," I said quietly, low enough that only he could hear. "Be careful what you measure." Then I left. Outside, the October air was cool against my skin. Traffic lights blinked red, then green. People walked by, unaware that something irreversible had just been spoken inside that restaurant. I did not cry in the car. I did not call a friend. I drove home in silence. Because silence, at my age, is not surrender. It's assessment. And as I pulled into my driveway, one thought settled in with certainty. He believed worth was visible. He had no idea how it was structured. I stayed silent. And that was his first mistake. When I got home that afternoon, the house felt exactly the same. The same cream-colored walls. The same quiet hallway. The same grandfather clock ticking in the living room. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside me. I set my purse on the entry table and walked into the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window over the sink, catching the edge of the marble countertop. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. Worthless. The word didn't echo the way Daniel probably expected it to. It didn't shatter me. It clarified something. For 32 years, I had been married to Richard. I supported him when his first startup failed. I worked part-time while Daniel was still in elementary school to help cover the mortgage. I hosted dinners for investors in this very house, smiling politely while making sure the roast didn't burn. I didn't hold him back. I stabilized him. But stability doesn't sparkle the way novelty does. Claire sparkled. She wore white linen to lunch. She talked about beach properties and partnership. She praised Richard publicly. She applauded his ideas before they were fully formed. Daniel saw applause. He mistook it for value. That evening, Richard called. His voice was careful. I didn't expect that, he said. Neither did I. I replied. He's under pressure, Richard continued. The firm's expanding. Claire's been encouraging him to take bigger risks. Encouraging. That's generous of her, I said evenly. There was a pause. You know he didn't mean it, Richard added. I didn't answer immediately. Meaning isn't the point, I said finally. He said it. Another silence. Claire. Feels like you've always judged her, he said. I don't judge her, I replied. I observe. Richard sighed softly. I just want everyone to get along. At 71, I've learned that getting along often means one person swallowing more than they should. I'm not at war, I told him. I'm just no longer participating in revision. Revision? Yes, I said calmly. The kind where history is rewritten to make the present more comfortable. He didn't respond. After we hung up, I walked into my study. The shelves were lined with old binders, financial statements, property documents, trust agreements. I've always kept records. Not out of suspicion, out of discipline. Daniel thinks Claire brought success into his father's life. What he doesn't understand is structure. Assets don't appear because someone claps loudly. They exist because someone signed carefully. I sat down at my desk and opened a leather folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were documents related to the family holdings, investments, shared property, long-standing agreements that predated Claire by decades. Daniel had called me worthless in a restaurant full of strangers. But worth isn't determined in public. It's determined in quiet rooms, over time, through decisions that don't need applause. I closed the folder slowly. He believed visibility was value. He had forgotten who built the framework he now stands on. And I was done letting him forget. The next morning, Claire called me. Not Daniel. Claire. Her voice was smooth, almost sympathetic. I think yesterday got out of hand, she said. I agree, I replied. I know Daniel can be intense, she continued. He's passionate. He wants his father to feel supported. Supported. It was the same word Richard had used. Support doesn't require demolition, I said calmly. There was a brief pause on her end. I think there's been a misunderstanding about roles, she said. Richard feels freer now. Less constrained. Constrained. I leaned back in my chair. For 32 years, I paid the bills on time, I said evenly. If that felt like constraint, it was the kind that keeps the lights on. She gave a soft laugh. Not mocking. Not warm either. You've always been very structured. Yes, I replied. That's how things last. Another pause. Daniel feels like you've never believed in his father's bigger vision, she said carefully. I considered that. When Richard wanted to invest in a risky tech startup in 2004, I asked for audited numbers. When he wanted to refinance the house to expand his second office, I insisted on fixed rates, not adjustable ones. That wasn't disbelief. It was discipline. Belief without due diligence is gambling. I said. I don't gamble with family. Claire didn't respond immediately. Then she shifted. You know Daniel handles most of the newer financial decisions now, she said. He's very capable. I noticed the phrasing. Handles. Newer. Most. I'm aware he thinks that, I said calmly. There it was again. A small silence. Because what Daniel believes and what is legally structured are not always the same thing. After we hung up, I walked into the hallway and paused in front of an old framed photograph. Daniel at 12 years old, standing beside Richard at a Little League field. His smile wide. His confidence fragile. I raised him to value steadiness. Somewhere along the way, he began valuing spectacle. That afternoon, I received an email from the family accountant. Routine quarterly summary. Attached were updated statements for the Whitaker Holdings Trust, created long before the divorce. Long before Claire. Long before Daniel learned to measure worth by volume. I opened the spreadsheet. Several key assets were still under my authority as co-trustee. A few distributions required dual approval. Certain property interests had protective clauses built in. Daniel may feel empowered. Claire may feel influential. But influence and control are not the same. Late that evening, Daniel texted, Mom, we need to clear the air. I stared at the message for a moment before replying. Air is clear when truth is. He didn't respond. I didn't expect him to. At lunch, he called me worthless. He said it loudly, publicly. But what he doesn't understand yet is this. Worth isn't proven in restaurants. It's revealed in records. And I keep very good records. 2 days passed before Daniel showed up at my door. He didn't call first. He didn't text. He just stood on my front porch at 7:15 in the evening, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders tight. When I opened the door, he looked older than he had at lunch. Can we talk? He asked. I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he used to do algebra homework. The same table where I once explained compound interest using a jar of coins. He didn't waste time. Claire said you've been reviewing trust documents, he said. I review documents regularly, I replied calmly. That's not what I mean. I folded my hands on the table. Then say what you mean. He exhaled sharply. Are you planning to do something? There it was. Not an apology. A calculation. Do something about what? I asked. About what I said, he answered. At lunch. The word lunch felt small compared to what happened there. You called me worthless, I said evenly. That's not a scheduling error. That's a declaration. He ran a hand through his hair. I was frustrated. With me? I asked. With the way you've always controlled everything, he shot back. Controlled. Interesting word. For 32 years, I said calmly, I managed risk. That's not control. That's stewardship. He leaned back in his chair. Claire says you never believed in Dad's bigger vision. Your father's bigger vision, I replied, was financed through smaller, disciplined decisions. He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted the conversation. Claire and Dad are restructuring some holdings, he said carefully. They want to simplify things. Simplify? By removing me? I asked. He hesitated. Not removing. Just consolidating. I stood up and walked to my study without asking him to follow. He did anyway. The shelves lined the walls, leather binders labeled by year. Inside them were decades of records. Not because I expected betrayal. Because I respect continuity. I opened one drawer and removed a thick folder. This, I said, placing it on the desk, is the original structure of Whitaker Holdings. He looked down. The majority of the commercial properties were placed into trust before your father remarried. He frowned slightly. I know that. Do you? I asked gently. I flipped to a specific page and turned the folder toward him. Section 4.2. Dual Trustee Authority. He read silently. In the event of asset liquidation, both co-trustees must authorize distribution, he read aloud. Yes, I said. And you're still co-trustee, he added. Yes. The room grew quiet. Claire thinks Dad can reallocate things more freely, he said slowly. Claire thinks a lot of things, I replied. Thinking and signing are not the same. He looked up at me. So what are you saying? I'm saying, I answered evenly, that if anyone attempts to restructure holdings without honoring the existing framework, it won't process. He stared at the folder. That's why you've been so calm, he said. Calm. He mistook composure for ignorance. At lunch, I continued, you measured worth by applause. He opened his mouth to interrupt. I raised a hand gently. Let me finish. He closed it again. You saw Claire praise your father publicly. You saw her encourage expansion. You saw her support him. Yes, he said. What you didn't see, I replied, were the 32 years of insurance renewals, refinancing decisions, payroll adjustments, tax negotiations, and quiet corrections that kept everything solvent. He swallowed. You think Claire's using him, he said. I think Claire enjoys influence, I answered. Influence feels powerful when you don't understand structure. He shook his head. You're making this about money. No, I said softly. You did that when you called me worthless. Silence. Real silence. You think I'm trying to take something from you, he said finally. I think, I replied, that you've forgotten what was never yours to assume. That sentence landed harder than I intended. He stood up and paced once across the room. So what happens now, he asked. I closed the folder. Now, I said calmly, nothing dramatic happens. He stopped pacing. But any attempt to shift authority without my signature will trigger review, I continued. And I won't authorize anything built on disrespect. You'd block Dad, he asked. I would protect the structure, I answered. He stared at me for a long moment. You're serious? Yes. He exhaled slowly. At lunch, he thought he was exposing weakness. Tonight, he realized he had exposed something else. You've always been like this, he said quietly. Unmovable. Not unmovable, I corrected. Measured. He didn't argue. For the first time since that restaurant, his voice lost its edge. I shouldn't have said that, he admitted. No, I agreed. You shouldn't have. He looked down at his hands. I didn't mean you're worthless. I studied him carefully. You meant I was replaceable, I said. He didn't deny it. That hurt more than the word. Because replaceable suggests that decades of partnership can be swapped for applause. He finally looked up at me. What do you want from me? There it was again. Negotiation. I want you to understand something, I said quietly. He waited. You don't get to rewrite 32 years of stability because 3 years feel exciting. The room felt still. I'm not competing with Claire, I continued. I'm protecting the foundation you're standing on. He didn't respond immediately. Then, softer than before, he said, I didn't realize you still had that much authority. Authority. He was finally using the right word. I never lost it, I replied. Outside, a car drove past. Ordinary night. Ordinary neighborhood. Inside, something had shifted. He came to confront me. He left with information. And information, unlike applause, changes behavior. As he walked toward the door, he paused. Claire won't like this, he said. I'm not managing her comfort, I replied calmly. He nodded once. Then he left. I locked the door behind him and returned to the study. At lunch, he called me worthless in a room full of strangers. Tonight, in a quiet house lined with records and signatures, he learned something simple. Worth is not volume. Worth is leverage. And he had just remembered who holds it. The house was quiet after Daniel left. Not tense. Not heavy. Quiet in the way it feels after something important has been clarified. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't review the documents again. I simply made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table, letting the clock tick in the background. For the first time since the lunch at Luca's, I wasn't replaying his words. Worthless. The sting had faded. What remained was structure. The next morning, I received an email from the family accountant. Subject line, request for asset review. Initiated by Richard Whitaker. I opened it slowly. Attached was a proposal to refinance one of the commercial properties held under Whitaker Holdings. A significant property, the kind that anchors the rest. The note at the bottom read, awaiting co-trustee authorization. There it was. Daniel hadn't exaggerated. They were attempting to simplify, which, translated, meant leverage. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I drove to the property in question, a 3-story brick building in Stamford that Richard purchased 20 years ago. I remember signing the original documents. I remember insisting on conservative financing terms when the market was euphoric. That building survived 2 recessions. Because of caution, I parked across the street and watched tenants come and go. A law office on the 2nd floor. A small design firm on the 3rd. Stability isn't glamorous. It's quiet. My phone buzzed. Claire. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, she said, her voice polished as always. I assume you saw the proposal. I did. We think this is the right moment, she continued. Rates are favorable. It gives us liquidity. Liquidity. And risk, I replied calmly. There was a pause. You don't trust the strategy? She asked. I trust documentation, I said. Send the full projection models. Silence. You want more data? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Richard thought you might resist, she admitted. I don't resist, I replied evenly. I review. The difference unsettles people who are used to applause. Daniel feels like you're blocking progress, she added. I watched the building across the street. I'm preventing erosion, I said. When I ended the call, I didn't feel angry. I felt aligned. That afternoon, Daniel texted. Claire says you're questioning everything. I responded, I question risk, not people. He didn't reply. By evening, revised documents arrived in my inbox. Assumptions inflated. Revenue projections optimistic. Exposure larger than necessary. It wasn't reckless, but it wasn't disciplined either. I closed my laptop. At lunch, Daniel measured my worth in comparison to another woman's enthusiasm. Now he was discovering something else. Enthusiasm signs quickly. Authority signs carefully. And I was in no hurry. I didn't reject the refinancing proposal immediately. I waited. Waiting is a form of power people underestimate. 2 days later, Richard called. His voice carried the kind of patience that's practiced, not natural. Claire said you're hesitating, he began. I'm reviewing, I corrected. We've already discussed the upside, he continued. This could free up capital for expansion. Expansion into what? I asked calmly. There was a brief pause. Daniel's firm, he said. They're scaling faster than expected. Of course. It wasn't just liquidity. It was leverage to fund momentum. I asked for full projection models, I replied. The revised version still assumes 12% annual growth. That's aggressive. Richard exhaled. You've always been conservative. I've always been solvent, I answered. Silence. You don't trust Claire's instincts, he said. This isn't about instinct, I replied evenly. It's about exposure. He didn't argue that. Instead, he shifted. Daniel feels like you're punishing him for what happened at lunch. There it was again. The assumption that structure is revenge. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm evaluating risk. But the timing, I interrupted gently, is the result of paperwork crossing my desk, not emotion. Another pause. You know, he said carefully. Claire has been instrumental in rebuilding my confidence. I considered that. Confidence is valuable. But it doesn't replace due diligence. I'm glad she supports you, I said calmly. Support and strategy are different functions. He sighed softly. You don't see what she brings to the table. I see it clearly, I replied. What I'm assessing is what she's willing to put on the line. That quieted him. Later that afternoon, Daniel showed up again. Not at my door this time. At the Stanford property. I was standing outside, reviewing tenant turnover reports with the property manager. He stepped out of his car, jaw tight. You're delaying everything, he said without greeting. I'm protecting everything, I answered. He glanced at the building. Dad thinks you're stalling to prove a point. If I wanted to prove a point, I said evenly, I would have blocked the proposal outright. He frowned. You're not blocking it. I haven't decided. The difference matters. He ran a hand over his face. Claire says the bank needs confirmation within the week. Then Claire should have structured the timeline more conservatively, I replied. Frustration flickered across his expression. You don't trust her. I don't outsource judgment, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. At lunch, he said quietly, I thought you were stuck in the past. I held his gaze. And now? He glanced at the building, then back at me. Now I realize you're still holding the keys. Not metaphorically. Legally. I didn't smile. This building survived 2 recessions because no one rushed a signature, I said calmly. You want to expand? Build something new. Don't gamble what's already stable. He didn't argue this time. He just nodded once. And for the first time since that restaurant, his voice carried something different. Not anger. Awareness. Worth, he was beginning to understand, isn't volume. It's veto power. And I still had it. Daniel didn't argue again that afternoon. That was new. Instead of pushing, he asked a different question. If we build something new, he said, standing beside me on the sidewalk across from the Stanford property, would you support that? Support. It was the same word Claire used. I would review it, I replied. He almost smiled at that. That's not the same. No, I agreed. It's better. He looked at the building again, watching a tenant lock the front door for the evening. Claire thinks leveraging existing assets shows confidence, he said. Confidence is easiest when the collateral isn't yours alone, I answered calmly. He didn't respond to that. Later that evening, I received an email directly from Claire. Not polished, not layered in charm. Attached were updated projections, this time more conservative, lower growth assumptions, longer timelines. A contingency plan included at the end. Progress. At the bottom of the message, she wrote, "We've revised based on your concerns. Let us know if this aligns more closely with your expectations. Not your comfort, your expectations." That distinction mattered. I reviewed every line, adjusted risk thresholds, marked sections with notes. Then I requested one more change. A cap on exposure tied specifically to Daniel's firm performance, not projected valuation. An hour later, Daniel called. "You're asking for performance triggers?" "Yes." "That limits flexibility. It protects stability." He exhaled slowly. "You're not trying to stop us." "No," I said evenly. "I'm trying to prevent you from learning a painful lesson." There was a long pause. "At lunch," he said quietly, "I thought Claire brought strength into Dad's life." "She may have," I replied. "But strength isn't proven by volume. It's proven by what survives pressure." Another silence. Then something shifted. "Claire's been pushing hard for this," he admitted. "She thinks hesitation signals weakness." "Hesitation signals calculation," I said. He didn't argue. The next morning, Richard called again. His tone was different this time. Less defensive. "Claire says you're willing to approve with conditions." "I am." He paused. "She didn't expect that." "Why?" I asked. "She thought you'd block it out of pride." I let that sit for a moment. "Pride blocks," I said calmly. "Structure adjusts." That afternoon, the revised agreement came through with my requested safeguards included. I signed it. Not because I was pressured, because the numbers made sense. And when I did, I noticed something unexpected. Claire sent a short message. "Thank you for pushing us to tighten it." No flourish. No smile. Just acknowledgement. At lunch, Daniel believed worth was applause. Now he was seeing something else. Authority doesn't shout. It calibrates. And when it moves, it does so deliberately. For the first time since that restaurant, I wasn't defending my position. I was shaping it. And they were beginning to understand the difference. A week after I signed the revised agreement, Daniel invited me to dinner. Not at Lucas. At his house. Claire answered the door. No air kiss this time. No theatrical warmth. Just a measured nod. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I prefer progress to distance," I replied. The house looked different than it had a few months ago. Subtle upgrades. New artwork. A larger dining table. Expansion, even before expansion. We sat down. Richard poured wine. Daniel cleared his throat as if he were about to present to a boardroom. "I wanted us all in the same room," he said, "because things are changing." I waited. He glanced at Claire briefly, then continued. "The refinancing went through. With the safeguards you requested." "With the safeguards we agreed on," Claire corrected gently. Daniel nodded. "Yes. Agreed. Small shift. Important shift." Dinner was calm. No raised voices. No performance. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set his fork down. "I was wrong at lunch," he said. The room stilled. Claire didn't interrupt. Richard didn't deflect. "I reduced something I didn't fully understand," Daniel continued. "I equated visibility with value. I didn't rush to soften it." "Yes," I said. He swallowed. "I thought Claire brought structure into Dad's life." Claire remained still beside him. "And?" I asked quietly. "And I forgot you built the original structure," he said. There it was. Not an apology wrapped in emotion. An acknowledgement wrapped in clarity. Claire finally spoke. "I pushed for speed," she said. "You pushed for protection. That doesn't make you obstructive." She met my eyes directly. "That makes you disciplined." 3 weeks ago, she measured influence by how loudly she could advocate. Now she was measuring it by what held. "I don't compete with you," she added. "I just didn't realize you were still the axis." Axis. That word lingered. I took a slow sip of water. "I don't need to be the center," I said calmly. "I need the structure to remain intact." Daniel nodded. "That's what I didn't understand," he said. Richard leaned back in his chair, quiet but attentive. For years, he had lived between us. Applause on one side, accountability on the other. Now the lines were clearer. "Worth," I said evenly, "isn't measured by who cheers the loudest. It's measured by who signs when it matters." No one argued. Dinner continued. Not celebratory. Not tense. Balanced. As I stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the door. "I won't speak to you like that again," he said quietly. I believed him. Not because of emotion. Because of awareness. In that restaurant, he thought he was elevating someone by diminishing me. Now he understood something simpler. Diminishing the foundation weakens the entire house. And he finally knew who poured it. The Monday after that dinner, something unexpected happened. Daniel forwarded me an email. Subject line: investor presentation, draft for review, not for approval. For review. That distinction mattered. I opened the attached deck slowly. Slide after slide outlined expansion plans for his consulting firm, measured growth targets, diversified client acquisition, contingency planning. At the bottom of the financial summary was a note: risk exposure capped per trustee recommendation. Trustee recommendation. Not obstacle. Not interference. Recommendation. My phone rang a few minutes later. I figured you'd want to see it early, Daniel said. I appreciate that, I replied. I also included downside scenarios, he added. Claire suggested we show both ends clearly. That was new. Claire had once equated hesitation with weakness. Now she was incorporating limits. That's responsible, I said evenly. He paused. I used to think you thrived on control, he admitted. Now I see you thrive on continuity. Continuity. Yes, I said. Because continuity survives emotion. He didn't argue. Later that week, Richard called me for coffee. Just the two of us. We hadn't done that in years. He looked older across the small table at a cafe in Greenwich. Not frail. Just reflective. I misjudged something, he said quietly. What? I asked. I thought Claire's enthusiasm replaced what we had. I waited. It doesn't, he continued. It complements it. But it doesn't replace it. Replacement. That word had hovered beneath everything since lunch. I never asked to be replaced, I said calmly. I asked not to be erased. He nodded slowly. Daniel sees that now. I believed he did. Not because of guilt. Because of exposure to process. At the end of the week, I received a formal notice from the bank confirming the refinancing had been finalized under the revised terms. Conservative leverage. Performance triggers active. Safeguards intact. Structure preserved. That evening, Daniel texted. We landed our first new contract under the expansion. Without overextending. I smiled slightly. Good. A moment later, another message appeared. And Mom, I meant what I said. I won't speak to you like that again. I didn't respond immediately. Then I typed. Respect isn't emotional. It's consistent. He replied with a simple, understood. At lunch, in that restaurant, he believed worth was measured by who inspired louder confidence. Now he was learning something quieter. Confidence built on structure lasts longer than confidence built on volume. And this time, no one had to raise their voice for that lesson to land. A month after the refinancing was finalized, Daniel asked if I would attend a small investor luncheon. Not as a silent guest. As part of the table. It was held in a private room at a hotel in Stamford. Nothing extravagant. Just 12 people, polished wood tables, filtered afternoon light coming through tall windows. Claire was already there when I arrived. She stood when she saw me. I'm glad you came, she said. I'm glad I was invited, I replied. There was no edge in my voice. Just fact. Daniel approached with a folder in his hand. I want you seated beside me, he said. Not across the room. Not at the end of the table. Beside him. That, too, mattered. During the presentation, Daniel spoke clearly about expansion strategy. When he reached the slide detailing risk controls, he paused. We revised our structure after internal review, he said. We chose discipline over speed. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. One of the investors asked, who pushed for that adjustment? Daniel answered without hesitation. My mother. No laughter followed. No discomfort. Just nods. And she was right, he added. Claire sat across from us, listening. Not overshadowed. Not defensive. Balanced. After the luncheon, as guests filtered out, one of the investors approached me. You must be proud, he said. I value sustainability, I replied. He smiled. Same thing. When the room cleared, Daniel turned to me. I wanted you to hear that, he said. Hear what? I asked calmly. That your perspective carries weight, he answered. It always had. The difference now was that he acknowledged it publicly. Claire stepped forward. I underestimated the value of restraint, she said quietly. That's on me. There was no sarcasm in her tone. I underestimated how easily visibility can be confused with contribution, I replied. She nodded. No tension. No rivalry. Just recognition. As we walked out of the hotel together, Daniel slowed his pace slightly. At lunch, he said, I thought defending Claire meant diminishing you. I looked ahead at the parking lot. Defending someone, I said evenly. Doesn't require erasing someone else. He absorbed that. I see that now. We reached our cars. There was no dramatic embrace. No emotional collapse. Just alignment. A month ago, in a crowded restaurant, my son stood up and called me worthless. Today, in a room full of investors, he stood up and credited my judgment. He didn't raise his voice either time. But only one of those moments carried integrity. Worth is not proven in conflict. It's proven in correction. And this time, he corrected it himself. A few days after the investor luncheon, Claire invited me to coffee. Just the two of us. We met at a quiet cafe in Greenwich. Morning light filtered through tall windows, catching the steam rising from our cups. No audience. No agenda. I've been thinking about that lunch, she said. So have I replied. She didn't avoid it. When Daniel said you were worthless, she continued, I didn't stop him fast enough. That was honest. You didn't start it, I said calmly. No, she admitted. But I benefited from it. The word benefit settled between us. At the time, she said, I thought he was defending me. I didn't question the cost. I took a slow sip of coffee. Defense that requires damage isn't defense, I replied. She nodded. I've spent the last few years proving I belong, she said. Proving I add value. And you do, I answered evenly. Just not by comparison. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. I thought if I wasn't louder, I'd be invisible, she admitted. Invisibility and irrelevance aren't the same, I said. She smiled faintly at that. I misread you, she continued. I thought your calm meant disengagement. My calm means I don't panic, I replied. Silence settled, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I don't want to compete with you, she said finally. You don't need to, I answered. There's enough structure for more than one perspective. That seemed to ease something in her. Later that week, Daniel stopped by again. This time not to argue, not to defend, not to negotiate. I've been reviewing old documents, he said. Which ones? I asked. The original partnership agreements. The early mortgages. The tax filings from the first expansion. I raised an eyebrow slightly. And I didn't realize how much you handled, he admitted. Handling isn't glamorous. It's repetitive, detailed, unnoticed. I never needed recognition, I said calmly. I needed continuity. He nodded slowly. I confused visibility with contribution, he said again. Yes, I replied. You did. He looked around the study, at the binders lining the shelves. I don't want to erase you, he said quietly. You can't, I answered gently. But you can forget. And that's almost as damaging. He absorbed that. The tension that began in a crowded restaurant had transformed into something else. Not reconciliation built on apology. Recalibration built on awareness. At lunch, Daniel thought he was elevating someone. In reality, he was revealing what he misunderstood. Now, he wasn't trying to repair an insult. He was rebuilding perspective. And perspective, once corrected, tends to last longer than pride. 3 months after that lunch at Luca's, we were all back at the same restaurant. Not by accident. Daniel chose it. When he told me where we were meeting, I noticed the intention immediately. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. The hostess led us to a table near the center of the room. Not tucked away. Not hidden. Richard sat to my right. Claire across from me. Daniel at the head of the table. The same exposed brick. The same hanging lights. The same low hum of conversation. But the energy was different. No tension sitting under the surface. No performance. Just steadiness. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set his glass down and looked at me directly. I asked to come back here, he said calmly. Because the last time we were here, I said something I shouldn't have. The table grew quiet. Not dramatic. Just attentive. I called my mother worthless, he continued. And I was wrong. There was no rush in his voice. No defensiveness. I confused visibility with value. I confused enthusiasm with structure. Claire didn't flinch. Richard didn't interrupt. I won't make that mistake again, Daniel said. I didn't need him to apologize publicly. But he chose to. That mattered. I folded my hands on the table. Words reveal perspective, I said evenly. Growth corrects it. He nodded. I've been reviewing the older agreements, he added. The early loans. The risk controls you put in place. And I asked gently. I wouldn't have what I have without them, he said. Not applause. Not flattery. Acknowledgement. Claire reached for her water glass. I misunderstood you too, she said. I thought you resisted change. Now I see you protect continuity. I met her gaze. Continuity protects everyone, I replied. Around us, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm. Servers moved between tables. Glasses clinked softly. No one at the neighboring tables knew the history that had unfolded here. 3 months ago, Daniel stood up in this room and said I was worthless. Tonight, he sat down and recognized where the structure came from. That is the difference between reaction and reflection. When the check arrived, Daniel reached for it. I've got this, he said. I didn't argue. Worth isn't about who pays the bill. It's about who built the table. As we stood to leave, Daniel paused beside me. I was measuring the wrong things, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. You were. Outside, the evening air felt cool and clean. The same street, the same traffic, the same city, but the balance had shifted. I didn't raise my voice that day in the restaurant. I didn't defend myself. I didn't compete. I let the structure speak. If you've ever been reduced to a comparison, if you've ever been told you were less because someone else was louder, remember this: volume fades. Foundations remain. At lunch, my son called me worthless. A few months later, he understood something simple. Worth doesn't need applause. It needs endurance. And I've been enduring and building all along.